The bitter wind howled across the desolate landscape of Merc 7, a frozen moon where humanity's grand terraforming experiment had failed spectacularly. Shattered greenhouse domes loomed like broken eggshells against the perpetual twilight sky, their once pristine surfaces now jagged monuments to corporate hubris. Between these skeletal structures, a lone figure trudged through knee-deep snow, her lavender skin almost blue with cold, white hair whipping violently around her face. Saren clutched a small bundle to her chest, wrapped in an ornate ceremonial cloth whose vibrant patterns were now dulled by frost and grime. Inside, her infant daughter Ariel whimpered softly, the bioluminescent markings on her tiny cheeks pulsing weakly with each labored breath. The child's glow had dimmed over the past days, a worrying sign that Saren tried desperately to ignore as she scanned the horizon for shelter. "Just a little further, my star," Saren whispered, her cracked lips barely able to form the words. "We'll find somewhere warm soon." But this was a lie, and Saren knew it. They had been wandering for days since being driven from the last settlement. A group of miners who'd taken one look at Saren's unmarried status and the strange markings on her child before declaring them both unclean, dangerous to the community's fragile equilibrium. Before that, it had been the technicians' outpost, and before that, the remnants of a religious sect who'd once welcomed Saren as their midwife, then cast her out when she questioned their doctrine after her husband's death. The snow was falling harder now, crystallizing on her eyelashes and coating her threadbare coat. Her legs trembled with each step. The weight of Ariel, feather-light though the malnourished child was, seemed to grow heavier as fatigue overtook her. Ahead loomed another abandoned dome, half collapsed and surely as cold as everywhere else, but at least it might block the wind. Saren struggled toward it, her breath forming thick clouds that obscured her vision. 3 more steps. 2. Hadn't realized she was struggling until he tightened his grip. She fell still, focusing instead on the warmth of her child pressed between them and the approaching light, which she now saw came from a small, retrofitted station module half buried in the snow. The man kicked at the door, which slid open automatically, then ducked inside. Warm air, wonderfully, impossibly warm, enveloped them as the door sealed shut behind them. The sudden silence after the roaring wind was almost as shocking as the heat. He laid them both on a narrow cot, then turned to a control panel, fingers flying over the buttons. The lights brightened slightly, and a soft hum indicated systems powering up. "You're lucky I found you," he said without turning. "Another few minutes, and you'd both be dead." Saren pulled herself up to a sitting position, still cradling Ariel. Now that they were in the light, she could see the man clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with unkempt dark hair and a beard that suggested months without proper grooming. His thermal suit bore the faded insignia of Horizon Axis, the corporation whose failed terraforming project had abandoned Merc 7 and its inhabitants years ago. "Thank you," she managed, her voice raw. "But why? Why help us?" The man turned, his expression guarded. "I was checking sensor arrays when I picked up your heat signature. Barely registering, but there. Couldn't just leave you out there." He paused, studying them with narrowed eyes. "What are you doing out in a Class 5 storm anyway? With a child, no less." Saren looked down at Ariel, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, the glow in her cheeks slightly stronger now in the warmth. "We had nowhere else to go." The man frowned but didn't press further. Instead, he moved to a storage compartment and extracted thermal blankets, a canteen of water, and what looked like emergency ration bars. "I'm Miles," he said gruffly, handing her the supplies. "This is my outpost. Not much, but it's warm." Saren accepted the offerings with trembling hands. "I'm Seren. This is my daughter, Ariel." She hesitated, then added, "If you want us to leave once the storm passes." "Don't be ridiculous," Miles cut her off. "Storm's forecast to last at least 3 days. And you're in no condition to go anywhere. Rest. Eat. We'll figure out the rest later." He turned away abruptly, busying himself with equipment on the far side of the small module. Saren watched him warily as she sipped the water, clean and slightly metallic tasting, and broke off a piece of the ration bar. It was bland but filling, and she savored each bite, realizing how close to starvation they had come. As Ariel stirred in her arms, Saren unwrapped the ceremonial cloth slightly to check on her. The child's skin was warming, her luminescent markings glowing more steadily now. Saren brushed a finger over one of the patterns, a swirling line across her daughter's cheekbone that matched the one her father had borne. "Your child," Miles said suddenly from across the room. "Those markings. She's Sinjin, isn't she?" Saren stiffened. The genetic modifications that caused bioluminescence were rare, controversial, and often met with suspicion. They were remnants of the early terraforming experiments, when Horizon Axis had attempted to create humans better adapted to low-light environments like Merc 7. Her father was, Saren admitted cautiously. "Does that matter to you?" Miles was silent for a long moment, his back still turned. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't matter. Not anymore." Something in his tone, a quiet resignation, perhaps, or buried grief, made Saren wonder what his story was. But exhaustion was quickly overtaking her, the warmth and relative safety lulling her towards sleep. She arranged Ariel more comfortably in her arms, leaned back against the wall, and surrendered to unconsciousness. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Miles glancing back at them, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Saren awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was the biting cold, the constant struggle for each breath? Then memory returned. The storm collapsing in the snow, the strange man carrying them to safety. Ariel was no longer in her arms. Panic jolted Saren fully awake as she sat up with a gasp. The movement sent pain shooting through her frost-damaged extremities, but she ignored it, eyes frantically scanning the small room. "She's here," came Miles's voice from across the module. "She's fine." Saren's gaze found him sitting at a small table, Ariel cradled awkwardly in one arm while he adjusted something with his free hand. The child was awake, her luminescent markings pulsing with a healthy glow as she stared up at Miles with apparent fascination. Relief washed over Saren, followed immediately by wariness. She had learned the hard way that help often came with conditions, expectations, demands. "What are you doing?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Miles glanced up, seemingly unsurprised by her tone. "She was fussing. You were dead to the world. Thought I'd let you sleep." He nodded toward what he was working on, some kind of mechanical device that Saren didn't recognize. "Just keeping her busy while I fix this water recycler. Parts are getting scarce." Saren pushed herself off the cot, wincing as pain flared in her hands and feet. Frostbite, she diagnosed automatically, though thankfully not severe. She crossed to Miles and held out her arms for Ariel. After a moment's hesitation, he handed the child over, careful to support her head until Saren had her securely. "Thank you," Saren said, the words feeling inadequate. "For everything." Miles shrugged, already turning back to his work. "Got enough supplies for a while. Storm won't let up for days yet." He paused, eyes flicking to Ariel. "Kid needs proper food, though. Got some nutrient paste that might work. Over there." He jerked his chin toward a storage compartment. Saren found the paste, a bland, nutritionally complete substance designed for emergency situations, and managed to feed some to Ariel, who accepted it eagerly despite its unappetizing appearance. The normalcy of the task, caring for her child in warmth and relative safety, brought unexpected tears to Saren's eyes. She blinked them away, determined not to show weakness. As the hours passed, they established an uneasy coexistence. Miles worked mostly in silence, moving between various maintenance tasks around the module. Saren tended to Ariel, rested her damaged limbs, and observed their reluctant host. The module itself was Spartan but functional, a main living area with cots, a small cooking station, storage compartments, and various pieces of equipment that Saren guessed were for monitoring and maintaining the life support systems. Everything bore the Horizon Axis logo, though many items showed signs of modification or repair. "You worked for them," Saren said eventually, breaking a long silence. Horizon Axis. Miles's hands stilled on the panel he was fixing. "Once," he admitted, Long time ago. But you stayed when they pulled out. Someone had to. His voice was flat, emotionless. Had my reasons. Saren thought about pressing further, but decided against it. They all had their stories, their wounds. If Miles wanted to share his, he would. Instead, she asked, "How long have you been alone here?" He shrugged, returning to his work. "Lost count. 2 years, maybe 3. And you've survived alone all that time?" Saren couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Merc 7 was notoriously hostile. The failed terraforming had left the atmosphere breathable, but the climate wildly unstable, with sudden storms that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. "I manage," Miles said simply. Then, after a pause, "What about you? Where were you headed before the storm?" Saren looked down at Ariel, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "Nowhere specific. Just away. The last settlement didn't want us." Because of her, Miles nodded toward Ariel's luminescent markings. "Partly," Saren admitted, "but mostly because of me. A woman alone, with a child but no husband. They call me unclean." She traced a finger along the edge of the ceremonial cloth that still wrapped Ariel partially. "I was a midwife in a religious community. When my husband died, they tolerated me for a while because of my skills. But when I questioned some of their teachings, they cast you out," Miles finished for her. "Zealots often do. Not just them. Every settlement we've tried. There's always a reason we can't stay." Saren's voice hardened. "So we keep moving." Miles was silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "You can stay here until you're recovered. Properly recovered, not just able to stand. The greenhouse dome a few clicks east sometimes produces edible plants. We can check it when the storm passes." Saren studied him, tried to read his intentions. "Why help us?" she asked again. "What do you want in return? A flash of something? Anger? Hurt?" Crossed Miles's face. "Not everyone wants something, Saren." He stood abruptly, gathering his tools. "I've been alone a long time. Maybe I'm just tired of it." With that, he moved to another section of the module, clearly ending the conversation. Saren watched him go, cradling Ariel closer. Trust didn't come easily anymore, not after everything they'd been through. But in this moment, in this place, perhaps they didn't have a choice. The days passed with an uneasy rhythm. The storm continued to rage outside, occasionally rattling the module's reinforced walls with particularly violent gusts. Inside, Miles maintained his distance, focusing on his endless repair work, while Saren cared for Ariel and slowly regained her strength. Food was simple but sufficient: ration bars, nutrient paste, and occasionally something Miles referred to as vat protein that he reconstituted with water. Water itself was carefully recycled and purified, a process Miles monitored obsessively. "Systems old," he explained grudgingly when Saren asked about his constant adjustments to the recycler. "Works, but needs babying." One failure could mean he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. On the third day, as Saren was changing Ariel's makeshift diaper, fashioned from soft material Miles had reluctantly sacrificed from his own bedding, she noticed the child's luminescent markings were dimmer than usual. "Is something wrong with the lights?" she asked, glancing up at the module's ceiling panels. Miles followed her gaze. "Running at normal capacity." "What?" "Ariel's markings," Saren explained, turning the baby slightly so Miles could see. "They're dimmer." Miles approached cautiously, peering at the child with an expression Saren couldn't quite read. After a moment, he asked, "Do they respond to emotions? Or health?" "Both. They brighten when she's excited or content, dim when she's tired, or—" Saren swallowed. "Or sick." Miles straightened immediately. "What does she need?" The directness of the question caught Saren off guard. I'm not sure. On Outremer, where we lived before, there were medications for Sinjin children. Special supplements. But here, what kind of supplements?" Miles interrupted. "Mineral? Protein? Light spectrum specific." Saren tried to recall the details from the medical facilities on Outremer. "Something with phosphorus, I think, and certain wavelengths of light." She looked helplessly at Ariel. "I don't know the specifics. My husband handled that part." Miles ran a hand through his disheveled hair, thinking. "I might have something," he said finally. "Wait here." He disappeared into a small storage alcove Saren hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a panel that required a specific sequence to open. She heard him rummaging around, muttering to himself. Finally, he emerged with a small vial of clear liquid. Emergency medical supplies, he explained, kneeling beside them. Phosphorescent compound for emergency markers, but it's biochemically compatible with human systems. Has the phosphorus she might need. He hesitated. I can't guarantee it's safe. Saren looked from the vial to Ariel, whose glow was definitely fainter than it had been. Without the proper supplements, Sinjin children often develop cascading system failures. Her daughter could die. Let me see, she said, holding out her hand for the vial. Miles passed it over, and Saren examined it carefully, drawing on her medical training as a midwife. The solution was similar to what she remembered from Outremer, though more concentrated. I'll need to dilute it, she decided, and just to drop it first to see how she reacts. Miles nodded and went to prepare the dilution according to Saren's instructions. As he worked, a question that had been nagging at Saren finally escaped her lips. How do you know about Sinjin needs? Miles's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their precise movements. I told you. I worked for Horizon Axis. In what capacity? A long silence followed. Saren thought he might refuse to answer, but finally, Miles said, I was a biotechnician, junior grade, involved in the early phases of the terraforming project. Understanding dawned on Saren. You worked on the Sinjin program. Among other things, his voice was carefully neutral. It wasn't my decision to abandon everyone when the project failed. There was more to the story. Saren could sense it in the tension of his shoulders, the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. But before she could probe further, he returned with the diluted solution. Here, he said, passing her a small dropper. Start with 1 drop. Saren carefully administered the solution to Ariel, who made a face at the taste, but swallowed it. Then there was nothing to do but wait, watching for any reaction, positive or negative. They sat together in tense silence, both focused intently on the child. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, Ariel's markings pulsed slightly brighter. Then brighter still. It's working, Saren breathed, relief flooding through her. Look, Miles nodded, his own relief evident despite his attempt to remain detached. We should monitor her closely for the next few hours. Make sure there are no adverse effects. They did just that, taking turns watching over Ariel as she slept peacefully, her bioluminescence gradually returning to normal levels. At some point during her watch, Saren dozed off, exhaustion overcoming her anxiety. She woke to find Miles sitting nearby, his gaze fixed on Ariel. There was something in his expression, a softness, a sorrow, that Saren hadn't seen before. You had someone, she realized aloud. Someone like her. Miles didn't look up, didn't deny it. My niece, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Emma, early Sinjin prototype. They said she was stable. Saren waited, sensing there was more to come. When the evacuation order came through, we were supposed to be on the 3rd transport. But Emma got sick suddenly, the same dimming of her markers. I tried to get her the supplements she needed, but in the chaos. He shook his head. By the time I found them, she was too weak. They wouldn't delay the transport. Said anyone not aboard would be left behind. So you stayed with her, Saren guessed. Miles nodded once, sharply, for all the good it did. She died 2 days later. I buried her under the eastern greenhouse dome. It was her favorite place, the only spot on this godforsaken rock where anything actually grew. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Saren didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She knew from experience how hollow they would sound. Instead, she said simply, I'm sorry you lost her. Miles finally looked up, meeting Saren's eyes. I'm sorry about your husband. It wasn't forgiveness or absolution for either of their perceived failures. It was something more essential, recognition of shared pain, of understanding. In that moment, something shifted between them, the wariness not disappearing entirely, but making space for something else. The storm's weakening, Miles said after a while, nodding toward a monitor display. Should clear by tomorrow. If you're feeling up to it, we could check the greenhouse dome. See if anything survived the winter. Saren nodded, recognizing the offering for what it was. I'd like that. The next morning, the storm had indeed passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by drifts of snow that glittered in Merc 7's perpetual twilight. Miles outfitted both Saren and Ariel with thermal gear, all of it oversized but better than their previous clothing, and led them across the frozen terrain toward the eastern greenhouse dome. Unlike the shattered structures Saren had seen during her desperate journey, this dome was mostly intact, though clouded with frost and missing panels in several places. Miles approached a small service entrance, keying in a code that made the door slide open with a protesting groan. Inside, the air was noticeably warmer, though still cold by human standards. What struck Saren immediately was the smell. Beneath the metallic scent of machinery and the mustiness of decay was the unmistakable fragrance of living plants. After months of nothing but recycled air and the sterile scent of snow, it was intoxicating. Miles led them through corridors lined with dead hydroponic systems to a central chamber where, miraculously, several beds of vegetation still flourished under artificial lights. The plants were strange, twisted, stunted things with pale leaves and bulbous roots, but undeniably alive. Adaptive clover, Miles explained, kneeling beside one of the beds. Modified to survive with minimal light and nutrients. Not exactly a feast, but edible. High protein content. Saren crouched beside him, Ariel securely fastened to her chest in a makeshift carrier. How has it survived all this time? Automated systems. Solar panels still work well enough to power the essential functions. Soil recyclers operate at about 60% capacity. He gestured toward a complex arrangement of pipes and filters. It's not perfect, but it keeps going. There was something in his voice, pride, perhaps, or vindication, that made Saren look at him more closely. You've been maintaining this place. Miles shrugged. Someone had to. After Emma, I needed a project. Something to focus on. It's amazing, Saren said honestly. She reached out tentatively to touch one of the clover-like plants. Its leaves curled slightly toward her finger, responsive to the warmth. Life finding a way, even here. It needs help, Miles corrected her. Constant maintenance, adjustments. Left to itself, everything here would die within a month. Saren thought about that as she watched Miles harvest some of the clover, carefully selecting mature specimens and leaving the younger plants to continue growing. There was a metaphor here, she realized, about life on Merc 7, about survival, about the choices they'd all made. We could help, she said impulsively. With the maintenance, I mean. While we're here. Miles looked up surprised. You're planning to move on when you're recovered. It wasn't quite a statement, not quite a question. Saren hesitated. The truth was, she had nowhere to go, no destination in mind. She'd been running from rejection for so long that movement itself had become the goal. Maybe not right away, she said carefully. Ariel is doing better here, with the supplements. And the clover would be good for her. She paused. If you don't mind us staying longer. Miles studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, I don't mind. The module's small, but we can make it work. And there's plenty to do here. It wasn't an effusive welcome, but Saren hadn't expected one. For people like them, survivors, outsiders, trust came slowly, in increments. This was a beginning. They spent the rest of the day at the greenhouse, Miles showing Saren the various systems that needed regular attention. It was complex work, requiring knowledge of both biology and engineering, but Saren was a quick study. More importantly, it gave them a shared purpose, something to focus on beyond their individual traumas. As they worked, Ariel watched from her makeshift carrier, her luminescent markings pulsing with interest at the new environment. Occasionally, Miles would explain something directly to the child, his gruff voice softening almost imperceptibly. Saren caught these moments and filed them away, evidence that beneath his hardened exterior, Miles was capable of gentleness. By the time they returned to the module, laden with harvested clover and with samples of the phosphorescent compound for Ariel, the first tentative roots of connection had begun to form between them. That evening, as Miles prepared a meal that incorporated the fresh clover, a vast improvement over their previous fare. He suddenly froze, head tilted, as if listening. "What is it?" Saren asked, immediately alert for danger. Miles moved quickly to a monitoring station, fingers dancing over controls. "Signal," he said tersely, "coming from the old relay tower to the north. It just activated. Is that unusual? It's been dead for years." Miles's expression had turned grim. Something must have triggered it. Power surge from the storm, maybe. But if it's broadcasting... He looked up, meeting Saren's eyes. Others might pick up the signal. Come to investigate. The implication was clear. Scavengers, desperate survivors, or even Horizon Axis cleanup crews. None would be welcome visitors to their fragile sanctuary. "Can be shut down?" Saren asked, already mentally preparing for another displacement, another journey into the unknown. Miles nodded slowly. "Manually, yes. I'd have to go to the tower itself, cut the power at the source." He glanced at the monitoring system again. Another storm's brewing, though. Less severe than the last, but still dangerous. "How soon? 6 hours? Maybe 7. Miles ran a hand through his hair, calculating. "Enough time to reach the tower and back, if I leave now." "I'm coming with you," Saren said immediately. Miles shook his head. "Too dangerous. You need to stay with Ariel. I'll bring her. We've survived worse than a walk through the snow." Saren met his gaze steadily. "I'm not letting you risk your life alone, Miles. Not after everything you've done for us." He started to argue, then seemed to reconsider, studying her determined expression. "It won't be easy," he warned. "And if the storm hits early, then we'll deal with it," Saren said firmly. "Together." Something flickered in Miles's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant admiration. After a long moment, he nodded once. "All right, together. But we leave in 15 minutes. Prep Ariel for cold weather exposure." As they prepared for the journey, bundling Ariel securely and gathering emergency supplies, Saren found herself wondering at the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had been ready to die in the snow. Now she was voluntarily heading back out into the cold, not in desperation, but with purpose, to protect this unexpected haven they had found. The relay tower stood on a low rise about 3 kilometers from the module, a skeletal structure of metal lattice crowned with communication equipment. In the ghostly twilight of Merc 7, its warning lights blinked red, active for the first time in years. They approached cautiously, the wind already beginning to strengthen as the new storm gathered force on the horizon. Ariel was securely strapped to Saren's chest, bundled in thermal blankets, with only her eyes visible. Miles led the way, breaking a path through the snow with grim determination. "There," he said finally, pointing to a control panel at the base of the tower. "That's what we need to access." As they drew closer, Saren saw that the panel was partially encased in ice, its edges sealed by frozen condensation. Miles produced a small tool from his pack and began carefully chipping away at the ice, his movements precise despite the thickening snow and rising wind. "How long has this been transmitting?" Saren asked, positioning herself to shield Ariel from the worst of the wind. "Hard to say. Hours, maybe. Long enough for anyone monitoring these frequencies to pick it up." Miles continued working, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Horizon Axis maintains automated listening posts throughout the sector. If they detect activity here... He didn't need to finish the thought. Corporations like Horizon Axis didn't appreciate loose ends, especially those that might expose their negligence. An abandoned moon was one thing. A moon with survivors who might tell tales of corporate malfeasance was quite another. The ice finally gave way with a sharp crack, revealing the control panel, a complex array of switches and indicators, some still glowing with power, others dark and lifeless. Miles studied it, frowning. "It's worse than I thought. The surge has fused some of the circuits. I can't just shut it down remotely." He pointed to a maintenance hatch higher up on the tower's frame. "I'll need to climb up, disconnect the power coupling physically." Saren followed his gaze, anxiety coiling in her stomach. The tower swayed slightly in the strengthening wind, and ice coated much of its frame. That's too dangerous, Miles. We don't have a choice. He was already shedding his outer pack, lightening his load for the climb. Listen, if I'm not back in 20 minutes, or if the storm hits full force before then, head back to the module. The path should still be visible for another hour or so. I'm not leaving you, Saren insisted. Miles turned to her, his expression fierce. Yes, you will. For Ariel's sake, if not your own. His eyes flicked to the bundle against her chest. That child needs you alive, Saren. Before she could argue further, he began to climb, moving with surprising agility up the tower's framework. Saren watched anxiously, instinctively rocking Ariel, who had begun to fuss, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. Miles was about halfway up when a particularly strong gust of wind hit the tower, making it sway alarmingly. He clung to the metal frame, waiting for the oscillation to subside before continuing his ascent. Finally, he reached the maintenance hatch and pried it open, exposing a tangle of cables and components within. From below, Saren could only see his silhouette as he worked, occasionally illuminated by sparks when he cut or connected something. The wind was howling now, driving snow and ice particles horizontally through the air. The storm was arriving faster than anticipated. Miles, she called up, her voice nearly lost in the gale. The storm's here. We need to go. He either didn't hear or chose to ignore her, continuing his work with single-minded focus. Saren clutched Ariel closer, torn between the need to seek shelter and her unwillingness to abandon Miles. Suddenly, the tower's warning lights flickered, then went dark. At the same moment, Miles emerged from the maintenance hatch, giving Saren a thumbs up before beginning his descent. Relief flooded through her, only to turn to horror an instant later when a section of the ice-covered framework gave way beneath his weight. Miles fell several meters before catching himself on a lower crossbeam, but the impact was violent enough that Saren heard his cry of pain even over the wind. He hung there for a moment, one arm clutching the beam, the other seemingly useless at his side. Without thinking, Saren rushed to the base of the tower, positioning herself beneath him. Miles, she shouted, can you make it down? He looked down at her, his face pale with pain. Dislocated shoulder, he called back. I can try, but... He glanced at the remaining distance, clearly calculating his chances. I'll guide you, Saren promised. Just take it.